there were three logical ways to get to the East, either around the globe, either through the Eurasian heartland, or going around Africa. And of course the polar route, which was of very difficult access back then, but perhaps changing. The fact that the route around Africa became the most popular for centuries was, I think, quite relevant because it helped in the minds of people to separate the two continents of Europe and Asia. They were, after all, so far apart if you take that route. European imperialism is a good place to start because European imperialism, in a way, brought the idea of Eurasia closer to realization, but farther away. It is true in an obvious sense that European empires were an attempt to bring Europe and Asia under a common European rule, and in some cases empires were created that spanned the whole of the supercontinent. The Portuguese Empire, very brief, was already an indication of that, all the way to Malacca, to Macau, the Dutch Empire, and more obviously and spectacularly the British Empire. It's possible if Europeans had managed to include China in their orbit, which never really happened, and it's an interesting fact that it never really happened, and if they had managed to solve their own internal conflicts and disputes in a sort of concert of Europe that really worked, then we could have seen a Eurasian empire arise under European direction. It didn't happen, and it didn't happen, I think, for one fundamental reason, because Europeans, at the same time that they were expanding to Asia, were also developing this very marked distinction and division between Europe and Asia. A distinction that many times acquired rather ugly undertones of race and racial superiority. It was not as Eurasians that Europeans wanted to rule Eurasia, it was as Europeans. This contradiction could not be solved. Let me quote you from an author that is many times regarded as a liberal, a apostle of toleration and political moderation. Here's what Tocqueville writes about this. We should almost say that the European is to the other races of mankind what man himself is to the lower animals. He makes them subservient to his use, and when he cannot subdue them, he destroys. Tocqueville is not necessarily advocating this view, but he's describing what the view was in the 19th century, the high day of this sort of racial views. On these grounds, on these bases, no genuine Eurasian empire could be built. And in fact, recently I've been looking at this more carefully as I try to get over some of the prejudices and received ideas that I think we all get and turn out to be quite wrong. As I look more carefully at the history of European imperialism, I start to realize how weak and fragile European imperialism truly was. If you look at it carefully, the failures, the weaknesses start to manifest themselves at the very moment of its successes. From the very moment when European rule was established in some of these old ancient lands, you could see the future image of its collapse, if you look carefully. In this respect, European imperialism actually reminds you of the empire of Genghis Khan. You know that the Mongol Empire started to fall apart at the very moment when it was realized. It was realized with Genghis Khan, and after his death, you could see already the empire breaking apart into four main segments, which, by the way, turn out to prefigure, almost to predefine future empires. So the Mongol Empire breaks down into a Middle Eastern section, a Russian section that is almost a prefiguration of the future Russian Empire, Chinese section, and a Central Asian section. European imperialism is, I think, in this respect, quite similar Every time you see European empires reach its fullest expansion and development, you can already see the seeds of their future downfall. So that it actually becomes quite difficult to find the period where they are expanding, successful, and growing. In this sense, I think the comparison is fair, but in another sense, it's quite unfair to compare European imperialism to the Mongol Empire. It's true that Genghis Khan and his successors were able to perhaps build the greatest empire in human history on the basis of one or two very successful innovations in the art of war, but the possibility of developing the technology to hold Eurasia together was much beyond their capacities or even imagination. Whereas Europeans truly for the first time developed the kind of technology that could keep a vast supercontinent like Eurasia together. And what is this technology? Shipping, railway, instant communications like the telegraph, banking, insurance, hotels, the Suez Canal, so critical to even starting to think of Eurasia as a single whole. Education, scholarship, the study of languages, the study of civilizations, archaeology, all this was critically important to develop a view of Eurasia as a whole, to the point where I think it is in fact this continuous effort to develop the Eurasian perspective that by the end of the 19th century leaves us with, for example, the concept of the Silk Road, invented by a German scholar, Richthofen, in Berlin in the late 19th century. If you actually read his work, it's about a page or two. He doesn't think it's a good idea, a good concept. It's only in the 20th century, in the 30s, in fact, that Silk Road starts to be a very popular idea. So Silk Road never really existed. Silk Road is an invention with a few decades, which we use to project back into the past at the moment when we start to think of Eurasia as a single whole. And that's a disagreement I have with authors that try to explain the history of the world in terms of a Silk Road, which of course was of very negligible importance. Very little trade happened across the Silk Road. Whatever trade happened was done in segments. A traveler or a trader would travel maybe 50 miles, 100 miles, never really leaving home, would pass on the goods to the next traveler who would travel 50 or 100 miles. There was no sense of spanning the whole supercontinent. The trade was negligible, unimportant. And so you see why I'm inclined to think that Eurasia is a more recent invention. Now, whether you think that Europeans developed advanced technology and then were able to conquer Asia, or whether you think that Europeans developed advanced technology because they wanted to conquer Asia, and I think this second hypothesis is actually more plausible. In either case, it is very obvious that with European imperialism, Eurasia could, for the first time, be thought of as a single whole. Europeans were so convinced of the superiority of their way of life that eventually they attempted to convert the whole of Eurasia to this European way of life. And their ability to shape and to rebuild life and institutions all across Eurasia was, from a historical point of view, unprecedented. For the first time, the influence traveling from west to east was able to break distance, was able to overcome political barriers, political borders. But paradoxically, and here we get to the point where Eurasia is about to be born, paradoxically, as they took the fruits of European civilization to some of these old, long-living, and powerful Asian empires, they were also sowing the seeds of their future downfall. They were spreading the technology that had given Europeans their concrete advantages. They were spreading the organizational skills that had given Europeans their concrete advantages. One could already imagine a day when influence would start to flow in the opposite direction, not just from west to east, but also from east to west. When did it happen? Well, I would suggest that, in fact, if you want to find a year when one could already see the beginning of this great influx in the opposite direction starting to be formed, the best candidate is 1919. So very appropriate to be speaking about that. Very appropriate to be speaking about that in Vienna, and very appropriate to be speaking about that in Vienna in 2019. Why 1919? Why 1919? And you can read a little bit about that in a wonderful book by the historian John Darwin called After Tamerlane. Well, in March of 1919, British officials reported wide-scale riots in Cairo, the city linking Europe and Asia through the Suez Canal. And really this was the beginning point of Egyptian nationalism, so powerful that it became the inspiration to many other nationalisms across Asia and Middle East and India and the Far East eventually. In India, also in 1919, a new rebellion had to be crushed. At Amritsar, we're celebrating the 100 years, a brutal, cruel massacre for no purpose and with no necessity, something similar to Game of Thrones in the last season. A brutal massacre that in a way showed to the whole world that British rule in India was no longer legitimate. And we're also commemorating 100 years of that, of course, with many Indian intellectuals calling for Britain to formally apologize. But it hasn't quite happened yet. This was really the moment when Indian nationalism changed, when Gandhi became influential, when the Indian National Congress decided that only full independence was acceptable. So things were changing. This was also the year, by the way, that the Soviet Union started to coalesce to recover some of its, from some of the territories that had been lost after the revolution, when Comintern was founded, when the idea of the Soviet Union actually influencing the rest of the world became a reality. And finally, in the dying Ottoman state, a gentleman called Mustafa Kemal was throwing Europeans out, shaking off European influence, creating a new state in the Turkish Revolution. The second of three critical revolutions throughout the 20th century, in which three proud, long-living Asian nations decided that a new global order was needed. Russian Revolution in 1917, the Turkish Revolution in 1919, and then, of course, the Chinese Revolution, which concludes this series. But remember that 1919 was also the year where, in fact, a modern China was born, with the May 4th movement that we just commemorated, a year of important commemorations, the May 4th movement, when students all over China rebelled against the decisions that had been taken at Versailles, where it was decided that some of the old German territories in China would be granted to Japan. And so China rose up in a bout of national pride against the West, and very much with the idea of overturning the Western domination over China. And things were never the same. I think from 1919 to 2019, Chinese history is more or less a straight line where the goal is to return China to its rightful place and to overcome the century of humiliation. Chinese Communist Party was, of course, founded already in 1921. We're going to be commemorating the 100th anniversary. what we witnessed in 1919 was the initial attempt to build a future where the political nations of Asia would be sovereign and autonomous. Europeans had built a system where influence flowed almost without any obstacle from west to east. Asians would not be able to stop these flows. They would not be able to rebuild those dams or close them again. What they could try to do was, and has been, to reverse the flow of influence, or to make this influence flow in both directions, not just from west to east, but also from east to west, using the tools that they had learned from Europe. And after all, Mustafa Kemal in Turkey built a modern European state, but very obviously not a modern European state in order to become European, as many people think, but a modern European state in order to free Turkey from Europe. And there are speeches where Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, thinks of Turkey as an Asian nation. It seems obvious to him. We are Asians, but with a modern state built in the image of European states. End of the historical part, and what has happened? Well, 100 years later, we're in 2019, the prophecy of building a Eurasia where influence flows in both directions has been realized. So much so that I would say that just as European countries were 100 years ago Asian powers and had Asian empires, we are now at a moment where China has become a European power. China has become a European power. Some of you may find this a puzzling and a slightly mysterious formulation, so I will try to explain it. But clearly a watershed in political history. We saw something like this before when Russia became a European power and already forced enormous transformations into the European system. Perhaps it happened with Peter the Great at the beginning of the 18th century, or perhaps it happened later in the century with Catherine the Great. But at some point, Russia became a European power. It was accepted as part of the European system of power, and that system had to adapt to Russia. Well, now the transformation is much more decisive because China, at the other end of the supercontinent, has become also active in Europe and powerful in Europe. Let me give you 3 examples, 3 or 4, and I don't think more than that are necessary. Well, China has been able to draw many European countries into its geopolitical initiative that you may have heard about, the Belt and Road Initiative. Many European countries, by now I think 15 or 16 European Union members, so already a majority, have joined the initiative. China has been able to create a new organization, including 11, now 12 members of the European Union and 5 countries in the Balkans, called 16+1, now 17+1, after Greece has joined. This is a rather informal organization that meets every year, takes decisions about economic integration, economic projects, investment, and other decisions. Now, let me ask you if you think it would be plausible for Europe to create an organization including 5 states of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, and 12 Chinese provinces. You pick 12, and you create an organization including 12 Chinese provinces and 5 countries of Southeast Asia, and call it the 17+1. Has the European Union done this? Could the European Union do this? What would China think of the idea? Here's some questions for your reflection. Well, I think the answers are obvious. And finally, a very, very striking example. You know that the British Secretary of Defense had to resign recently. Why did he have to resign? A very complicated affair. Since being appointed, he always seemed someone who was very hawkish on China, very close to the United States, very suspicious of Chinese intentions, very determined to face what he saw as the Chinese threat. He made a speech announcing that the new aircraft carrier that UK is building would have as its maiden voyage a little excursion to the South China Sea. And he made this speech a week before the Chancellor, the Minister of Finance, Philip Hammond, was supposed to go to China. And an extraordinary coincidence, China canceled the visit after the speech, and Philip Hammond could not go to China. Then there was some attempt by the Prime Minister, Theresa May, to say that, after all, the carrier would stop in Singapore. It's not properly part of the South China Sea, just at the entrance. And the issue seemed solved. But then you remember that there was the necessity to determine whether Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company, could be part of the British 5G network. And the Prime Minister, Theresa May, decided that there was no reason to have a blank ban on Huawei, although there would be scrutiny over Huawei activities. And there was a leak to the newspapers about this decision and how dangerous it was. And Theresa May, in one of the most extraordinary political episodes in the past few years, wrote a letter, a public letter, to her Secretary of Defense, saying that she had determined, to the best of her ability, that the leak had come from him. She had asked him to check his cell phone and laptop, and he had refused. And so you would have to leave the government. Now, very complicated affair. You could even write a movie script about it. But doesn't it remind you of those of you who know history, because most of you are very young, doesn't it remind you of those periods where this happened in the developing world, where very complicated affairs involving political influence used to bring down ministers and governments in Pakistan, in Egypt, in Turkey, in Malaysia. But now it's the Chinese question that brings down ministers. And people are interested in who will be the next British Prime Minister in many ways because of Brexit, but perhaps even more interesting and more consequential, because I don't think whoever the Prime Minister is, the Brexit process will not be that much affected. But one thing that will be really significantly affected is whether the Huawei decision that Theresa May took is going to be reversed or not. And if Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, I would guess that it will be reversed. So you can see how China is right in the middle of the succession process in the UK. China is a European power. To sum up, before the modern age, one had a system where different empires lived in isolation. Habsburg, Ottoman, and Mughal empires around 16th, 17th century. Of course, Vienna as the seat of one of these empires, living relatively isolated, in competition on the borders, but relatively isolated. Then we moved on to the age of European imperialism, where only Europe lived in a kind of splendid isolation. What does splendid isolation mean? It means that you're able to influence other actors while not being influenced in return. You're isolated in the sense that you are protected, but it's a splendid isolation because you have power to influence others. Europe lived in splendid isolation for 2 centuries, and now Europe no longer lives in splendid isolation. China is everywhere in European politics. Russia is everywhere in European politics. Turkey is everywhere in Austrian politics. Fair enough or not? Turkey is not everywhere in Portuguese politics, but I have the impression that it is everywhere in Turkish politics, in Austrian politics. You'll tell me if I'm wrong. What I call the dawn of Eurasia is the birth of a system where influence flows in all directions, and we can no longer understand political questions in Europe in isolation. Let me finish with 2 examples. First, the question of populism. There is an intellectual fashion and tendency to explain populism on the basis of purely internal domestic factors. Why do we have populism in... I hear that you have something that can be called populism in Austria. Again, correct me if that's wrong. But why do we have populism in Austria, in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary, and in many other places, in France? Well, because questions of inequality have not been solved out of the financial crisis, because of the power of financial elites, because of the fall in public investment, because of the Eurozone crisis. It is very reassuring to think that these are the causes, because then we can solve them. And by solving them, we actually create a more just, a fairer society, so all would be well. But I think this is just wrong. If you look at populist parties all over Europe, competing for power, and in some cases actually being able to form governments, like in Italy, actually reminds us of populist movements in developing countries. I've already told you that in my view, some of the things that we see happening in Europe reminds us of developments that happened 100, 150 years ago in other parts of Eurasia. A sense of political, economic dependence, a sense of loss of control, which then is formalized in a nationalist, populist reaction against that. The sense that we are under threat, the sense we're under threat of being colonized creates a nationalist reaction. And as you know, there are now many people in Europe on the far right that speak of a kind of colonialization in reverse. European countries are being colonized by Islam, and a reaction against that is necessary. So we see the story being replayed, but this time in Europe. Listen to the populists in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary. I know them a little less well in Austria, the FPÖ. There is remarkably little in what they say about the existing social and economic structure. And in fact, in countries like Hungary and Poland, something that the ruling parties have not done is to question the existing economic and social structure. In fact, they seem to have reinforced it. If the problem was inequality, lack of labor rights, a sense of social unfairness, well, then these populist parties are not addressing it at all. In Hungary, the Orban government has revised labor laws in order to make it easier for German auto companies to move and to operate in Germany. And in Poland, the Prime Minister, Morawiecki, has said recently, I don't know why Brussels is so worried about us. Certainly international investors are not, and they are flowing into Poland. So they are not fighting global capital or foreign investors. What are they fighting? Well, what they talk about, and the source of their electoral appeal, is a world where European nations are in danger of disappearing, swamped by external forces they cannot control. Immigration, terrorism, trade, and the power of global bureaucratic elites. These are the threats. They promise to return Europe to a world where it felt protected from external influences, the splendid isolation of the past. It's the rise of the repressed that frightens populist leaders and the voters that pick them. Islam and terrorism, of course, China and economic dependence, and above everything else, the fear of what they see as a form of colonization in reverse, with the arrival of successive waves of immigration and the irreversible transformation of European societies. Exactly what people in India, in Turkey, in Iran, in China used to fear, and around which their politics was organized. Even their view, populist view of European elites, reminds us of the old nationalist movements in the Middle East, in China, or in Japan, where the local westernizers were seen as serving obscure foreign interests and selling their own countries for the best offer. And this is now the way that global bureaucratic elites or Brussels elites are described by populist parties. Let me conclude. I think we will understand very little of populism in Europe until we replace European politics with a much wider framework of reference, The loss of relative power by European countries created the new reality of a Eurasian field of forces, influence now increasingly flowing from east to west and no longer just from west to east, and the corresponding perception that Europeans are dependent on forces they cannot control. Populism is a reaction to these facts and to these developments. We will not understand populism if we don't have a Eurasian framework in our minds. Now, I could give you other examples, and perhaps there will be time for that. I don't think we can understand European integration in strictly European terms. From the description I gave of the populist phenomenon, you can already anticipate what I would say. I would argue, traditionally, we think of the problem of European integration as having to do with internal factors. The relation between Germany and France, the relative status of periphery and core, special economic interests of different kinds. This is the traditional way to think about the process of European integration and the obstacles it faces. Well, I think overlooked are the much more decisive factors of power competition across the Eurasian political landscape. Why don't we have a genuine political union in Europe? Well, because it was never necessary. That's the reason, because Europe lived in a kind of protected environment. All during the Cold War, Europe lived in a rather exceptional circumstances. The Soviet Union never really became an existential threat because of American security guarantees, unconditional American security guarantees. But at the same time, American society was so similar to European societies that, with a few exceptions, no one really took very seriously the idea that Europe was under American occupation. So entirely protected from Soviet threats and not really being threatened by the United States, what reason would there be for European nations to coalesce in a political union? There was none, but that could change. It's entirely possible that China will become the kind of threat that the Soviet Union never was, in part because the United States will certainly not offer the same kind of guarantees. That is already very obvious from developments in the United States. So to conclude, we will never understand properly the process of European integration, whether it has reached its end or whether it will develop further into a genuine political union, until we see the destiny of Europe as connected to the rest of Eurasia. China in particular at the other end. The fears about China may well prove to be overblown, but one way or another, whether they are overblown or not overblown, Europe and China are now so closely linked that their political destinies can no longer be understood in isolation. Whether Europe moves towards a genuine political union is a story where China, not Germany or France, will play the main and decisive role. Thank you very much. I think I'm more or less respecting the 30 minutes, maybe 35. And now I'll give you the microphone.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really glad to be here and that I have the honor to introduce you to our initiative, Europe Goes Silk Road. My name is Sebastian Meyer. I'm a civil engineer from the Vienna University of Technology. And here in the audience is my colleague, Sebastian Holler. He's a global historian from this house, so from the University of Vienna, and we are the expedition crew of Europe Goes Silk Road. yeah, we had the expedition too, and often one problem leads to some confusion because we got the same first names, but there is one really big advantage. If you call for a Sebastian, at least one of us will respond, I guess. So that's a good thing. The second really important part of Europe Goes Silk Road is our home base. And our home base consists of two members. One of them is Florian Grendel, here next to me. One of the members of the home base is Max Auer, also sitting here in the audience. And yes, the home base stays back here in Vienna, in Austria, and ensures that Europe Goes Silk Road, or let's say the content of Europe Goes Silk Road, looks good to all of you. So now you know our team, our four heads of the team. So we go on with the definition of the name Europe Goes Silk Road. It's of course hard to define Europe because it's a rather flexible term, but we try to think Europe in its broadest sense. So we say Europe consists of all the countries of the Council of Europe, including Belarus. And now the question, why do we call our initiative Europe Goes Silk Road? Yeah, it's because we grasp on site the current developments and what they mean for Europe. So now to the second part of our name, the Silk Road. We see the Silk Road as the entire historiogeographic region of the ancient Silk Road. So we don't say it's just a new Silk Road initiated by China the last years. No, we also ask the questions, what is India doing? What is the European Union doing? What is Russia doing? And so on. And we want to show you how and where all the initiatives of these global players intersect in Eurasia. So, similar to our broad definition of the term Europe Goes Silk Road is our vision. Oh, sorry, I forgot to press here the illustration of our sense of Europe, the Council of Europe and Belarus, and the historiogeographic region of the ancient Silk Road. So now to our vision. We at Europe Goes Silk Road share the dream of discover the unknown, connect people and ideas, and exchange with partners all over the globe to shape a common future of prosperity. This motto reflects and also includes the basis of Europe Goes Silk Road. Europe Goes Silk Road stands on the basis made of three main pillars. Discover, connect, and exchange. And now we want to show you what these topics mean to us. So let's start with discover. To put it briefly, we are going by car from Central Europe to Shanghai. And yeah, we know that there are already defined many corridors all over Eurasia, but we want to add another one. And the yellow drawn line here in this map behind me is our expedition route and our so-called corridor of understanding. And why do we call it corridor of understanding? Because we want to understand the current developments and fostering international understanding. Of course, we will visit spotlight projects of the Belt and Road Initiative like Piraeus, Kashgar, Quadra, and so on. But we are especially interested in what's going on in between these spots. And we want to consider all kinds of disciplines. So we really want to consider everything from A, like anthropology, to Z, like zoology, everything. So let me mention some examples. Logistics, like here the break of Gork in the small town of Chop in Ukraine. The expansion of the digital networks, like here in Pakistan. ecology, for instance, the impact on the aerial sea because of hydropower dams and the watering for agriculture. Arts and culture, like here, for example, the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. History, here on the example of Volgograd, because there are incidents that shape the history of Eurasia. Tourism, like here, riding tourists near Dunhuang in the Gobi Desert. Geology and resources, like here, one of the biggest gold and copper mines near Saindak in Balochistan, Pakistan. And the last example, also from Balochistan in Pakistan, security policy, where often problems with insurgents and so on. And so, all along our corridor of understanding, we want to connect all kinds of disciplines and, yeah, try to figure out which connections are between them. That's why we are going on site for you.
Thanks for the keyword, Sebastian. A corridor of understanding. We're building in order to exchange and to build a network of science, economy, and diplomacy. As we follow an interdisciplinary approach, our first thought was in building an advisory board around us of experts from different disciplines. In this advisory board, for example, we have Dr. Sebastian Kummer from the Institute of Transport and Logistics at the University of Economics and Business in Vienna, or Mrs. Vilina Chakarova, head of institute at IAS, who are also co-hosting this event today with us. Mr. David Morris, Mr. David Morris from the United Nations ESCAP, or Wade Shepard, a contributing journalist who is also author of the best-selling book Ghost Cities, and really concentrates on the Silk Road topic. And last but not least, we also announced honorary president of Europe Go Silk Road, Jacek Palkiewicz, who is the last great explorer of our time, who also discovered the source of the Amazon River, and is a fellow of the National Geographical Society in London. He is a personality that really inspired us in the way we are realizing our project just by going 33,000 kilometers from the heart of Europe to Shanghai. In order to build a network that is sustainable, we know we have to gather all our network partners and our experts along the entire corridor of understanding, so to speak. In order to have the sustainability, we need an entity in which our partners and our network can communicate, can connect with each other, and also exchange. And this entity is the so-called International Silk Road Society, a frame in which we also want to organize International Silk Road Congress 2020 in Vienna. Now we're coming to the last aspect, connect. The Silk Road as such, and also all Eurasian connectivity projects, will shape our common future in order that people in Europe are also informed and with the topic and engage with the topic. We share our story with them through classic media like print media, TV and radio, but also what's of course really important nowadays, for especially in order to reach young people, is of course social media. Because when we're talking about the future, we're also we are always talking about young people, because they are the future, so to speak. And if I'm allowed to cite Mr. Maçães here, we have to prepare them for a new world order in the 21st century, which is going to be an Eurasian world order. But there's one aspect we have to take into account, and that's the youth consumes information and content differently nowadays. They consume content that's short, they can engage with interactively, in small portions and daily. And that's what we have to take into account. What we also understand our project as is a project for fostering international understanding. We inform and we connect, not only between economy, science and diplomacy, but also between countries, cultures and people. And this in a completely new way, in a way especially the youth will understand. Interactive, short, on a daily basis, live, and last but not least, in first person. And how are we going to do that? Not like this, I guess. How are we going to do that? With live talks. Live talks is a new application we developed with our partners from TechWise. It's an application that combines knowledge transfer with thirst for adventure with adventure. Oh, it's not working. I guess we have to figure that out before we go. And it's the word live talks, the term derives from documentaries in live format, so to speak. A really completely new format in order to reach young people with the topic. And today the time has come. Now we're gonna officially launch it, and now the revolution of documentaries has come, and I'm gonna pass the word to Simon from TechWise in order to present the application to you.
So as we know, Europe Goes Silk Road stands for discover, exchange and connect. And the third part, as Florian already said, is about connecting people, connecting especially young people. That's why we built this platform, Live Talks. We want to reach you at home on the mobile phone. We want to tell you what's going on live on site. When Sebastian's going to be there in Afghanistan or somewhere else, they have some experience that they make. Experiences that you probably want to know about, like to meet new people, to meet new cultures, new countries, new places. And this is something you're probably going to be interested into. And Live Talks is the way to get this information. Pretty easy, from home, from your mobile phone. So, how does it look? This is how it will look on desktop, but we decided to start with the mobile view. So, that's how it looks now. When you go to Live Talks, you see where we are right now. We are in Austria, in Vienna. When you click on the current day on Austria, Vienna, you can see information about where we are. We are at the University of Vienna, and we have a panel discussion in a few minutes. And there's a quiz available as well. Quiz, we'll come to that later on. Let's go back to the home screen where we can start our journey. So, if you go to the home screen, as we said, you can visit the current day. But if you miss out a day, you can also look at days that have been gone before, and you can scroll into the map and you see where have they been exactly, which places did they visit, what was going on their day. So, as we can see, some days ago we decided to develop Live Talks, and our hometown is Amstetten. That's where we build it, and you can gather some information about TechWise, and you can gather some information about the initiative of Europe Goes Silk Road as well already now. This is really online already. So I'm really glad to show you the link, so you can take out your mobile phones right now. I'm going to wait for you a little bit. And you can enter the link and go to live.europegoessilkroad.eu. And once you do that, you can, like there's some new technology called progressive web apps. You can install the website on your mobile phone. This is how you can do it on the iPhone, I think. Yeah, on the iPhone, you can add it to your home screen, and then you can, it works like an app. And on Android, it looks like this. There's a little pop-up, and then you can add it to your home screen. And this way, you have the best experience possible. You have Europe Goes Silk Road live on your mobile phone with just one click, and you can experience what Sebastian and Sebastian are going to experience on their trip every single day. And they're going to give their best to keep the information up to date and to entertain you, not only to entertain you, but to transfer the knowledge, their experiences, the people they meet, and everything else. So, but there's another thing we saw before. There's a quiz, and we already put up a quiz for today. So to take part in the quiz, you just have to register. Just put on login and then register. You can register with Facebook, Google, or with email. And then you can take part on today's quiz. I was taking some time to fill out the form. It takes you as well, I think. And once you're registered, you can just click on the map or today, and you can go to the quiz, and you can answer the quiz throughout the whole event right now. And I don't know, probably someday after, like, when we have day 50 or something, we are going to put on even more quizzes and quizzes and quizzes. So if you continuously answer the quiz, probably one day there's a big prize for you. But let's see. So much about live talks. Now you saw all the features that we have now, and we really want to give you the best experience, because probably this is only the first journey that we're going to do with this tool, because infotainment could be a really good tool to bring and raise awareness for such important initiatives like Europe Silk Road is. And we want to make the best experience, and if you have feedback for us, please just approach us. We're here, and I hope you're going to enjoy the journey Europe Silk Road with the tool Live Talks.
Thanks for your presentation, Simon. This was basically Europe Goes Silk Road. Just a short reminder to representatives of the press and media who are here today. There's a press conference on Wednesday, also with Bruno Maçães and other prestigious guests. It's at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna at 10 a.m. in the morning on Wednesday. So I'm going to pass the word back to Dr. Edelmeier for the following panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. May I invite Sebastian Holler and Velina Zakharova and Bruno? Please take a seat. You in the center, yeah. Okay. May we have a second microphone, please? Yeah, we should discuss your ideas. Who wants to provoke? Bruno first. Ladies first.
Of course, sure. Is it working? Yeah. Okay, first I would like to thank the organizers of this very interesting event for having me here this evening. And of course, personally to Bruno for coming to Vienna and giving this keynote speech. Well, Bruno, you said that China has become a European power. And I would like to immediately launch a provocative debate on this by asking what can Europe do as a response to China becoming a European power? Is this kind of strategy of economic partner, strategic competitor, and systemic rival the right one? And how do you see, or where do you see actually the place of Europe in this big picture of global powers competition?
Thank you. Well, let me start by very quickly reacting to this fantastic presentation and to the incredible idea. I actually didn't know much before the presentation. You never told me many details. And I just decided I'm going to cancel all my plans for the next few months and I'm going to join you, actually. Hope you don't mind. No, I did most of it with the exception of the crossing the border between Iran and Pakistan, which I was always curious about. I hear it's not so easy, so I'll be watching online that particular segment of the trip. The question, well, yes, China is a European power. Europe has to live with that. I try to avoid two extremes, and I, if I was a decision maker, would try to avoid two extremes. The first extreme that we have to avoid is, well, first of all, thinking that China is going to disappear again. China was not present in our lives, it was not present in our politics, it was not present in our economy, and we may entertain the illusion, many people in Washington do, that China will again disappear. Maybe they'll have a financial crisis and the economy will tank and we don't have to worry about China again. And this, I don't have trouble making the prediction that this will not happen. Just look at the numbers. Even China grows by only 4% a year for the next 30 years. In 30 years, we will have an economy that will be close around 2.5 times the size of the combined EU economy. The five largest economies in the world are going to be China, India, Japan, the United States, and Indonesia. Just 20 years. So if you think that the world is going to be like it has been, I think young people should not make that mistake. Slightly older people who are perhaps excused, but not people your age. So we have to live with China as a great power. The other extreme that I'm trying to avoid is to think that because China is a great power, we have to go along with it. And I see the two mistakes being made. There's many people who think China is nothing to worry about, but there's also many people who are already announcing that we should join China's initiative. And I think this is wrong. Europe has to be its own source of power of influence. We should accept that we are going to be influenced by China, but we should also try to influence China. We should defend our interests. We should try to reach at a higher level, a higher point. China has its own ideas, we have our own ideas, and we meet at a higher plane. And this, by the way, is always the effort of civilization to find common points, to find agreements, to find even a higher egalitarian way to reconcile some of the contradictions. This is how human knowledge moves forward, and it's also true for different civilizations and different models of class. Healthy way of living with. And to go back to my initial comments, I think that's also a reason for your project to do that, and perhaps even to send a message to people your age that the time is not to be born in Germany, go study in France, and go work at the European Commission. This is not the world we live in. And President Macron said that every European in the future should learn and be forced to learn 2 European languages. He may feel that he's announcing a revolutionary future. No, he's talking about the past. Europeans today have to learn 4 languages, or why not be truly capable of proficiency. This idea that we're proficient in 2 European languages, that already makes you someone very cosmopolitan. Is something that I cannot
for being here, and especially for me, especially a big honor to have you here this evening. For me, and thank you very much for the praise, because today is like the peak of a project, of an idea that already emerged 4 years ago, and especially in the last year, we really worked really intensely on this project, and it's really great to see how this project has evolved and has now given its birth and is now alive. And what is really interesting for us and important for us is, and you mentioned in your comments, and thank you very much for that, and in your keynote, is we as Europeans have to engage more with the region. We have to, because our perspective for a long time only looked to the west, to the Atlantic Ocean, and we forgot, so to say, we forgot the eastern part, the big part of Eurasia. And for the future, we have to find our own point of view to all these developments that are currently going on. And Europe Silk tries to foster, especially young people, as we already heard today, with our goal, to foster young people to engage more with the topic, to look east, not only west, and to understand the region we will probably in the future more linked to. And in the outcome, not only say China is like the new hegemon for Europe, but to develop our own position in this Eurasia. And that's why we do not especially focus on the Belt and Road Initiative, but we chose the term Silk Road. You know, as we already heard today, it's a critical term in a lot of ways. But when we chose that term, not Belt and Road and other terms related to that, is that we do not want to focus on China, not only talk about China, because we are only talking about China. But why do we not talk about Europe in Eurasia? And that's why we call it Europe or Silk Road, and you also mentioned the year 2019 that it changed. It was a very not life-changing moment, but a very decisive year in the history of Eurasia. Maybe Europe was Silk Road in 2019 could also be at least a little bit decisive moment in the Eurasian history. Let's see how it turns out. And that was what I want to add to this from my side. But I wanted to ask you, you also traveled this entire region. I've seen you've been to Chechnya and all these regions. What were your findings on the ground that you would say are important or make travel important in this regard? What would you say? What is it? Why shall we go on site? Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. First, looking at the map, it's encouraged people in the audience to go to some of these places. It's all very safe, with one or two exceptions. Let's hope all goes well with one or two exceptions. But it's all very safe, it's all very easy. I say in the preface to my book that we live in the gold age of traveling. We just don't know it. Why the gold age? Because we have all this technology that makes it so easy. I was in Brunei a month and a half ago, and when we download a tax-paying app from a computer called Brunei, and we travel all around Brunei, taxes, everything, Google Maps, translators, emails, everything. Very easy, effortless way, so all the answers are powered. where there are so many safe and wonderful places, Uzbekistan is probably the cheapest place on earth. And now you don't need a visa. It's good to have a few places that you want to see. Those points were all very interesting. The RLC, I've been to a few of them. They're all wonderful and worth seeing, but keep your eyes open for the unexpected other things that they only hear about. So in my book, I say, on Bakri and actually, when no one whatsoever that you meet someone, and you're talking, and the guy in the bar told me, oh, there's this village where only Jews live and have lived there for centuries. Oh, where is it? I'll go tomorrow. Take some time for me. I'll have a reason to find it. Tomorrow. I met some young people, college students, and I was talking about these extraordinary temple rocks from the second century. No one knows it. There's a lot of unexpected happenstance, serendipity that happens during the trip. And one needs to have time to explore that and not overdo the plan part. By the way, I think that's one of the things that's wrong with journalism today is over planning. People go to a place, typical journalistic reportage these days is people go to a place in order to see something that they already know what it is, in order to say something that they already writing the draft of the report of the plan to the place. And then they look around for a couple of people to repeat the sentences that they want. They don't say in massage the sentences a little bit. Then they get back to the this is no way to understand the world. So in some sense, I think there. You may arrive in Kazakhstan thinking that it's leadership, and in fact, when you live, by the time you leave, you start to wander on. Or the other way around. This kind of exploration, one thing that's what's in the think tank reports and the newspapers already tell you, most of the time, truth is wrong.
Okay, thank you. I think before we are running out of time, we should open the session for questions.
Thank you very much for your comments, and especially the keynote speech. Sorry, my name is Adam. I'm associated with the Institute for Austrian Institute of European Security. What I'm currently interested in is how does China feel in its own initiative when, let's say, more affluent European countries are starting to sign up? So whether it needs to be signing a memorandum of understanding or even Austria thinking about issuing handles like that could be Portugal is thinking of as well. Actually, specifically handles, how do you feel about those, and how important is it to China that more affluent countries with better creditworthiness are starting to think about this? Yeah, I think that's very important. It's only the second phase in the development when you have developed countries join. going to transport the goods from Korea,
distance of going around the Iberian Peninsula, and with the railway that already exists but can be improved, get all those goods to the core of Europe or get German cars out to China. So these will open incredible opportunities of a much quicker impact with less risk for China. And also in terms of prestige, you know, I live in Beijing, and during the week that Italy was about to join the Belt and Road and then join the Belt and Road, every morning when I went to the gym, there were the TVs playing, and there were Italian politicians on Chinese national TV speaking and news about the event. It was really a moment where, very helpful for Xi Jinping, a moment where Chinese authorities could say the Belt and Road is succeeding. Even Italy, a NATO member, part of the G7, is now part of the Belt and Road. And that's also why people in Germany and France got quite upset with the Italian decision. So I do think it's a new moment. On the renminbi and internationalization of renminbi and pound bonds, I think I remain quite skeptical for the time being, because a currency can only become a global reserve currency if it's freely tradable. But China has, of course, lots of hesitation about making the renminbi freely tradable. One of the obvious reasons is that perhaps a lot of renminbi would leave China the day it could. It became freely convertible, because we know that's what wealthy people in China think about day and night. So some of the things will be slow. Others are happening quite fast and dramatically. But that has been the history with the rise of different countries to global superpower status. The United States, for a new book that I'm writing, I've been reading about the rise of the United States in the 19th century. You know, 1835, 40, everyone thinks of the United States as a backwater country where nothing can ever become very important. And then things change quickly. And essentially from 1870 to 1890, the United States emerges not only as the largest economy in the world, but as a global military, political superpower. By 1900, it's deciding the Boxer Rebellion in China. And so what tends to happen with these processes is that they're slow at first, and then they accelerate. And the exact place we're at when it comes to China, I can't quite tell you. But I think we'll see a similar process, where for a while it might seem that nothing very dramatic is happening, and then almost overnight, lots of people missed, they were living through those years, and they didn't quite understand that the United States had become the most powerful country on earth. And we even have like an exact year, 1890. It was the moment that the United States overcome Britain as the largest economy and already started to make important global political decisions. It's possible we'll see the same when it comes to China.
Thanks a lot for this amazing presentation, and a very innovative one indeed. What I wanted to get back to regarding the project is, because I've been scrolling through the press section as well on the webpage, what exactly is the research part of the project? So obviously there's going to be a lot of observation, but what exactly are you going to research? Have you established a question or a topic overview? I don't know. And then the other thing regarding the project itself, I read that the idea was born during a trip on the Trans-Siberian Railways. But then how did you establish this amazing collaboration between the Deckweiss company and your project and those two guys who are going to travel? How did this all happen? And also connected to this, and sorry for getting into the details, but I didn't know about the press conference on Wednesday, so I'm going to ask it now. But feel free to postpone me to the informal part of the event. But how is this financed? The whole thing. I mean, I saw the partners, but maybe you can get into more detail about this. Thank you.
So first, about the research part, about the origin and the finance. These are very closely interlinked. I would start with the last first, the finance. Of course, such an endeavor, I mean, that's the entire project will last, I mean, the expedition will last for 8 months approximately, at least.
and such a huge endeavor and all the things around this project. I mean, it's not only the traveling, it's all the things around it. I mean, it's the TechWise, it's the app we have to finance and all these things. And people usually approach us with this question, who is financing this? Who has an interest in this project? And the funny thing is, it's just our own. It's a privately financed initiative just by us four, by Florian, by Max Auer, Sebastian Meyer, and myself. We saved money for years to make this project happening because we experienced with a former project in the past that they were very dependent on some sponsors or on one big sponsor, and we didn't want to be independent on one big sponsor. So we tried to organize this entire project that we can do it on our own. We are young, we can sleep in our car, we know good people who are young, who are highly skilled, and our approach is to work together with all people, especially of course also young people, who are specialists in a certain sector, and then create something, make something big of it. For instance, I mean, we have already seen what TechWise has done. I mean, that's amazing. But we also worked, for instance, together with Film Spectacle. It's one of the best movie time-lapse companies in the world. And they support us with all their videos. And I mean, that's a huge amount of money they just give us for free. And yeah, now I think it's all time to thank all the people who are supporting this entire project. Because it's not only about the people who are here in the front, Florian, we've seen Sebastian, also Max Auer, we have already seen the TechWise company, also Patricia, my girlfriend, Karina. There are a lot of people who are standing behind this project, and a lot of sponsors, a lot of, let's say, benefits in kind sponsors, small startups. And that's the finance part. And this now allows, first we thought that's a big disadvantage, because of course if you have a big sponsor behind you, you are really safe. But now it's an advantage because it is privately financed, because by our own, because now we are in the research part, now I come to research part, we are completely independent. We do not have to fulfill any goal a certain company or a certain organization or someone has. We can really explore on the ground and find completely new connections. And as also Mr. Maçães already said, the important thing is to go on the ground and not pre-phrase your questions before, especially. You have to be open on the ground for the new things and explore the new things. And our approach is a really holistic one. I am a global historian, so I have never looked into much detail in a specific discipline. I was always just looking for connections. For instance, I mean, that's not related to that topic, but I'm not an expert on the Silk Road or the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm rather more an expert probably on Antarctica, for instance. I'm focusing more on Antarctica but I try always to find new connections between geology, biology, infrastructure, all these disciplines, and merge them together and try to find something new out of it. And that's why there is no specific key research question in advance. We want to grasp the entirety of the project, of the things going on, and then portray them. And we have the second part is this engaging people more with the project. This engaging people also fostering people to engage more with their future, and that's more our second approach in this regard. And to the origin part of your question, I think I have already talked too long, so I forgot almost the most of it. But the question was why and how this project evolved. Yeah, it was on a trip from. So that's not the first thing we are doing. It was on a trip, and a colleague of mine sitting here in the middle, Lucas Beham, we did, and I think is someone else from the crew here.
No, yeah. And we did this trip 3 years ago, and it was not only about the Trans-Siberian. Our approach was to go by train from Europe, we started in St. Petersburg, to North Korea. So the final destination was North Korea, because we wanted to travel the entire span of Eurasia and get our own picture of this huge supercontinent. And then the idea emerged, okay, I mean, that's Trans-Siberian connection is the northern part of this trans-Eurasian connections. And as I said, I'm also a little bit a historian. Then this idea came up with the Silk Road and the southern corridors that are in the southern part of the continent, and that's how this project emerged. I hope I fulfilled your dreams of answering.
Well, let me say that even I, who kind of likes good hotels and good restaurants, and I took a similar trip, 6 months, exactly the same routes, with the exception of crossing the border from Iran to Pakistan, as I said. And good hotels were very rare, but when they were available, I did stay in good hotels. I went to the best restaurants in Tashkent and Tehran, which I recommend. But even I, with some of those tastes, spent over 6 months around 20 to 23,000 euros. Now, that's not a lot, is it? I'm pretty sure that if I lived in Vienna for 6 months, I'd spend more than that. So don't assume that this is so expensive if you're thinking about doing it. I think most of you could save 22,000 euros and do this for 6 months. It's easier to do when you're 25 than when you're 40, because when you're 40, you have to give up on a lot of stuff in your career and so on. But if you do it at 23, you're not giving up anything. And finally, just a couple of suggestions. First, it's very good now that we have the iPads to take a lot of books, to download them on the way. By the way, there's Wi-Fi everywhere now, and so download them on the way and read stuff about the countries that you're visiting as you visit them. In Turkmenistan, reading a couple of good books on Turkmenistan. And finally, if you end up in a police station, it happened to me 3 times, just keep calm. Things will be solved eventually. And you know, if you sleep in a police station, that's a 1 free night. So don't worry about it.
Just to add a few words on this, I think that the timing of this project is so perfect, because what's really unique now as compared to other decades is this interconnectedness, what was actually touched upon during the lecture. And I think that this interconnectedness, it goes in all directions. It goes east to west and west to east. And the new element that makes all of us being present today part of the processes is technology. So we all can shape processes bottom up. And that's really a new moment. And amid this global powers competition that is taking place right now, where we don't have the answers to so many questions, like where will be the place of Europe in all of these games? Will China really manage to rise? Will it be a systemic rivalry between United States and China? Where is the place of Russia in all of this? Because Eurasia was mentioned so many times today, but still we should keep in mind that powers, regional powers like Russia or even China in this specific region would never allow external players, will never allow an access of external players like European Union, European powers, or even United States to this huge landmass. Because as we know from the books, who controls Eurasia controls the world, to use this cliche. But to make a point, we all here, the citizens, have our decent place in the processes, because amid a fourth industrial revolution that is also taking place right now, and there is also competition among the big players, who is going to ride the wave? Who is going to win this competition? Who is going to make the best technological breakthroughs? We do have a saying in this. we citizens can also shape processes bottom up. And that's huge. That's good news for us. So I think that this will be one great occasion for us who support you in this, but especially for you, to show throughout these months how people are not only living there, but how they are interacting, how they are actually shaping processes, how is daily life, and what is your contribution to this. So I think that we should not forget this and we'll have to contribute more and more. And creating awareness is just the beginning, right?
Regarding the EU and the One Belt and Road Initiative, in your lecture you talked about like Germany, Italy, UK, but what I'm interested in is like Eastern Europe. Since the economic crisis of 2008, they've been struggling, but now they've been developing data infrastructure. Romania is one of the leading IT specialists, Czechia as well, and in, I think, 2015, China tried to establish a port in Montenegro. So how do you think are these eastern parts of Europe going to develop and try to to pave their own way in this new construction?
Yes, I mean, Eastern Europe has been very important to the Belt and Road from the start. Why? It's not because it's on the way or closer to China. The main reason is that China sees some of these countries as potentially capable of being included in Chinese value and production chains, whereas Germany and France are direct competitors for high-end technology. I think the Chinese see the possibility that countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, and even countries in Central Europe, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, can be integrated into Chinese value chains, can produce components for Huawei, for example. From the point of view of those countries, there's a lot of talk about the investment that they could attract. There's a lot of talk about infrastructure investment. All that is true, and these countries are interested in it, but don't forget about the politics. I think in many cases they are attracted to the possibility of bringing in another actor that can balance Germany, which they see as too overbearing and dominant in Europe. I think for countries like Hungary, Poland, Italy, outside the region, this is also an important consideration. And finally, remember that for a politician, it's always exciting to be involved in big projects. Sitting on the table with a Chinese minister and discussing the Belt and Road is probably going to be the highlight of your month for a minister in Slovakia. China knows this very well and is able to attract the interest, the attention of political classes in some of these countries. And some of these politicians, it's not my case. I don't get paid by the think tank that I'm associated with in Beijing. I don't get paid by any Chinese institution, although some people on Twitter sometimes say the opposite, and I don't want to be. I want to be free in what I say about China. But many former ministers in Eastern and Central Europe, I run into them all the time in Beijing universities, think tanks, agencies, companies. So that's also a reason that they sometimes have to think about their career after leaving office, and China offers a number of promises. I'll stop here. I've been too outspoken already.
Maybe I can add a few sentences. Every time when I'm asked about the Balkans, I come from the Balkans, I tend to answer with the following two quotes. One by, I think it was one of the European commissioners who said that we basically overestimated the Russian influence and underestimated the Chinese influence in the region. That's probably one quite good sum up of the situation in the region, in the Balkans. The way how I see it as a geopolitical analyst is that China, of course, uses the opportunity of a backdoor, so to say, to penetrate, of course, countries that are potential European Union candidates. That means at some point, of course, there is the possibility of them becoming European Union members. And we know that China is a country that has a different time dimension. If Beijing says 100 years is not a problem for us to wait, let's put it that way. We have countries that might join the European Union, and as such, if they have certain fields that are already, penetrated by Chinese business and are strongly influenced by Chinese investments, then this is, of course, an opportunity for China. To give you one example, for instance, Beijing signed free trade area with Georgia that had signed previously an association agreement with the European Union, which is basically a European integration without participation in institutions, because at some point it would include Georgia in the European common market. So it's a way of how to basically, be present on the European continent. These are countries with weak institutions. You can easily, let's say, find opportunities in business, in political partners, and it's just, a faster way of how to deal with the processes. And by the way, in China, the so-called now 17+1 initiative that was previously 16+1 is actually called 1+17, and that says everything, right?
Hello. Thank you very much, Dr. Bruno. My question is specifically for you. In terms of trade, I'm having a slight disagreement about the historical trade, which you said was marginal. If it was indeed marginal, then how do you explain the robust and consistent trade between China and the late Roman Empire and also later the Byzantine Empire, especially in regards to the silk, which was after all the most highly priced trade commodities in the late antiquity and the early medieval time as well as the spices from India. They were also highly priced and sought after. And part of the Pax Mongolica was also, unhindered trade. So Genghis Khan wanted to unhinder the trade throughout his empire and beyond. And in terms of migration and movements of people, you always had, different nomadic tribes moving to Europe from the depths of Central Asia. You had the Hunnish tribes, you had the Turkic tribes, and of course the Mongols. And it wasn't just one way, single traffic. It was also the other way, the eastward migration as well. You had the Indo-Europeans moving into Central Asia 3,000 years ago. So conceptually, it might not have been very much ingrained or permeated, but the global processes have been always there. So.
Well, my main point is let's not think that we are returning to a world where this supercontinent was integrated, that we are returning to the past, that we are imitating the past. Our friends here who are going on the Silk Road are more innovators than repeating something that's already happened. We know the people that did that, like Marco Polo and one or two more, because they were so rare. This was not happening all the time. And as I said, even Richthofen, when he talks about the Silk Road, he limits it to the Han Dynasty, 400 years. And he calls attention to the fact that it had very little impact on the economies on both ends, the Roman Empire and the Chinese Han Dynasty. The influence was very limited. China knew nothing about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire knew nothing or almost nothing about China. And then for a long period, the structure we had in Eurasia was essentially 3 blocks, became very stable. There was a sort of Western bloc going down to the Roman Empire, but then continuing in European feudalism. There was a middle section, mostly composed of the Muslim world, and then there was China. And for, 2,000 years, I think this was basically the structure of Eurasia. So what I'm saying, with all the good points that you raise, is this is really the first time that we're thinking about this space as an integrated field. Even the prehistory of the concept goes back maybe 100 years, not more than that. And this really is the age of Eurasia. I have nothing against the title Silk Road, of course, and it's a very evocative title that everyone likes, but I just cannot agree that, that we're going back to that world. It was outside the consciousness of people in Europe living at the end of the Roman Empire or at the beginning of the Tang Dynasty in China. It was not part of their world. I think you'll agree with that point, but I may have underlined that too much in the lecture, which I think is what you're saying.
Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions, then we will finish this session. Thank you for coming, and Bruno, thank you traveling to Vienna and to have given us this interesting speech. Yeah, that's it for today, and we hope that you will look in the future every day on what happens when Europe goes Silk Road. Goodbye and good evening. Yeah.